Hello, and welcome to Network Collective. Twice a month, network practitioners gather for a live stream virtual roundtable to discuss topics of interest to us and maybe only us. For those of us, for those of you watching live, you can tweet Network Collective and make it truly an interactive show. This week, we are talking about routing protocols. For most of us, when we enter a network environment, a good bit of the infrastructure is already built. Routing protocols are in place, and we're left to make incremental adjustments. But we wanted to examine what criteria should be considered when building a network infrastructure from scratch, especially with routing protocols. So to shed some light on this topic, we've invited two Layer 3 gurus, Russ White and Kevin Myers. Russ, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Russ White. Was that good, Yvonne?
Oh. Tell us where to find you.
You can find me at rule11.tech, and you can find me all over the web and other places as well.
All right. And Kevin?
Hi, my name is Kevin Myers. I'm a network architect and co-founder of IP Architects. We do a lot of different environments, ISP, WISP, wireline routing, network design, and enterprise and data center as well. And kind of getting into the white box thing, that's our specialty, is going into white box integration. So that's kind of my world.
All righty. I am Yvonne Sharp. I'm a consulting network engineer for a Fortune 500 healthcare enterprise. You can find me on Twitter at Sharp Network or on the blog at esharp.net. Phil, why don't you say hi?
Hey, everybody. I'm Phil Gervasi. I'm an network engineer in upstate New York at a pharmaceutical company. You can find me on Twitter at network_Phil, and my blog is networkphil.com. All
right. And Jordan?
Yes, I'm Jordan Martin. I'm at BC Jordan on Twitter. I blog at jordanmartin.net. My day job, I'm a data center technology consultant for Core BTS.
All right, let's kick this off with a simple question. So in today's environments, is one networking protocol really better than the other, or are they all really about the same? What do you guys think?
Depends on whether you're talking about IGPs or BGP, right?
All right.
Let's start with IGPs.
Okay, so IGPs. So I think that IGPs have come to the point now where they're beyond the scaling that most people need in their networks anyway. So they're all pretty much the same, other than some features and some ways of looking at problems, right? So whether you deploy ISIS or OSPF or EIGRP, there I said it, EIGRP.
just as long as you don't say RIP, we're good.
I can't. I can't say that. I don't know what that is.
Russ, what do you mean exactly by scaling?
So I think that I've actually seen ISIS, OSPF run in networks with 5,000 routers in a single flooding domain. If you have more than 5,000 routers in your flooding domain, then we need to have a discussion.
Heart to heart.
You must really like routers.
So, and that, Russ, I think that, and that it depends on the environment you're in and where you differ. And it depends on what routers you're using too, because, a lot of Cisco's always been the baseline for a lot of us, but, certain routers don't handle that as well as others. And it depends on the CPU and resources. So I think we had talked earlier about some different metrics to scale your IGP and when is my IGP flooding domain getting too big? And so, for me, I've seen some where you get into even a few hundred routers and a few thousand routes in OSPF that gets to be overwhelming. And so I think it's a very dynamic thing depending on what routers you're using and what your use case is.
But you're supposed to have end of life those Cisco 2500s.
So we're still depreciating those, Russ.
Yeah, that technology investment was supposed to last for 15 years. No, right. So when I talk to my customers about this, and I'm talking about routing protocols, I think for I don't know, I guess I'd say the large majority of the enterprises, right? Like the routing protocol that you choose is more about familiarity. And meeting specific requirements. I know that there are some things that one routing protocol does a little bit better than other, and we can talk about that as we go along. But the differences are fairly minute at this point, and so a lot of it comes down to supportability. Can you find engineers who can run this particular protocol? That's a big component. And the other component is the openness, right? So EIGRP, I think, is a fantastic protocol, but if you're going to run anything other than Cisco in your network, you have to make the decision about whether or not you're going to be redistributing between routing protocols or running only Cisco, which is not really a practical answer for most enterprises beyond the very small ones.
For right now, free range routing has an EIGRP open source implementation being worked on. The other thing is, I mean, there are some philosophical differences between them. In a link state protocol, you microloop during convergence in certain topologies. And so that means that you're looping packets. And in some networks, that's okay. In others, it's not. So the right way to solve that is to use EIGRP or, tune the routing protocol around thinking about these problems. So EIGRP drops packets rather than looping them. There are some topological things, right? I mean, if you're in a large-scale hub-and-spoke network, yeah, you can make OSPF work, you can make ISIS work, but you're making it work. It's not actually working well necessarily on that network. There are other solutions that will work better in those types of things.
So are you saying like OSPF and ISIS were designed more for mesh-style networks where there's many paths, multiple options?
Right.
Hub-and-spoke would lend better more towards a link state.
Or a path vector.
I'm sorry, a path vector, yeah.
Or a link state. Yeah, either one. I'm sorry, a path vector or a distance
vector. Yeah, I said the wrong one as well. Yep.
Yeah, one of those two is going to be better for you on a, but please don't do the ODR thing either. Okay.
Oh, but I love ODR.
I think Jordan recommended that earlier.
Yes, I did in Slack today. ODR. I'm kidding. Jordan, I don't like ODR.
You bring up a good point about the redistribution, because redistribution for me is almost like a 4-letter word. It's like an ejection seat. Like, yeah, it's there and you could use it and maybe you will have to use it one day, but I'd rather not have to use it. And so, trying to maintain a consistency as much as you possibly can and limit redistribution where you can, to me, it makes sense in a lot of networks, whether it's service provider or enterprise. That's one of my core tenets of design is redistribution is unavoidable, but I try to limit it as much as I possibly can to keep the design sane.
Yep. When I was on global escalation team in Cisco, I would say that 99.99% of the major network failures I ran into in some way related to redistribution. I mean, it's the first thing you do. If you run into a network that's failed, you're like, okay, first start cutting off alternate paths. So reduce your parallelism down to minimum. And 2, kill off redistribution or nail redistribution up with statics. And 99% of the time that solves the problem.
Or better yet, Russ, put an access list on your redistribution.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, if you're like in a network failure, you don't play with access lists. You just like static.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, just kill it and be done.
Yeah, kill it and be done. And then when it comes back up, then you can start thinking about, okay, now what do I do to actually fix this?
Right.
So it doesn't happen again. Yeah. And by the way, access lists, I actually prefer tags only because someone somewhere is going to forget to change the access list.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a fact of tags and communities for that purpose. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, in general, which routing protocol do you use? There are some very specific narrowish cases that I think you need to use one thing or another. Beyond that, I mean, I'll just, I can always be like Donnie Savage and say, you shouldn't use 4-letter protocols, but.
See, and I'm on the other side because EIGRP for me, I'm in a very multi-vendor world. I'm not in a Cisco only world. So EIGRP for me hasn't really existed beyond study for the last few years. And then I encountered every so often. I think it's great now that it's coming into free range routing because there are some great things about it, like, the unequal, the ability to unequally load balance and things like that. But, for me in my designs, OSPF has pretty much been the only IGP, unless we're talking about large, scale service provider or something like that. And we're going to get into ISIS.
I was going to say,
are we even going to talk about EGPs?
No, we can just keep going on. We can just
IGPs,
Yeah. No, so you need to branch out more to ISIS. I actually like ISIS better. Now, OSPF has some major changes coming right now or been worked on, but I actually like ISIS better.
Can you expound on that? Tell us why, Russ.
No, I shouldn't have even said it. Now I'm in trouble with all my OSPF friends. I'm going to get beat up at the next IETF. You're going to gather around me.
So, is there something about the topology, or is it the TLVs? Like, what is it about ISIS that lends you to saying that it would be your preferred over OSPF if you were deploying today?
So there are various reasons. Number one, it's a layer 2 protocol sitting by itself. It doesn't rely on IP. With link local and v6, that changes somewhat. With OSPF v3, it becomes much more similar, but I still really like the idea of not even having to give my segments, my transit segments, IP addresses, even link local. I can just shut IP down entirely and it still works type of thing. And so there are other things. It actually is more scalable in some ways because it does true incrementals. OSPF v2 can't do true incremental SPF. So it's just a little, to me, it's a little cleaner of a protocol the way it's designed. I like the way DIS works better than DR. So it's just always been my preference has been ISIS over OSPF. If I have the choice, even in small networks, I actually prefer ISIS.
Russ, let me ask you this. Do you run into issues with like firewalls and security devices and things because I just don't, outside of routers, I don't run into ISIS as much as a supported protocol when you're getting into devices that route but aren't routers.
The right solution is not to have firewalls.
There's a show. Okay. I think the other argument about ISIS is just, coming back to my, there's not many people who run it. And so, I understand it's huge in the service provider world. But when we're talking about enterprise customers, and we'll talk medium and below, when you're implementing a routing protocol, you're looking for something that you can readily find engineers who can run, who don't cost, multiple 6 figures a year to make it happen.
But I'll say this. I think that's a bit of a myth. I think people are scared of ISIS because it uses big addresses.
You think that's it? I think it's just familiarity because I agree with you. It's not that much different from OSPF, and the differences could be learned in a relatively short amount of time. If you're familiar with OSPF. Yeah.
I mean, in fact, when I taught boot camp for Cisco TAC, I used to teach OSPF first, and I would go through it. And I'd spend like 8 hours teaching OSPF. I get to the end of it, and they say, "Well, we only had 8 hours for link state, so how am I supposed to learn ISIS?" And I always just say, "Just forget half of everything I taught you, and you already know ISIS."
I have to agree with Jordan though about familiarity because ISIS is not part of the standard canon of Cisco curricula.
Oh, but it's coming.
Okay, it might be coming, but it hasn't. It's not really thus far.
I mean, it's on the CCIE blueprint now. I mean,
but nevertheless, when we're talking about enterprise environments, by and large, you don't necessarily have a dozen CCIEs at every single location.
That's fair enough.
Especially if you're talking about like a hospital with 8,000 people, right? So that's a little complexity there with 50 sites. I'm making up numbers. So you say, all right, we're in all Cisco environment. I just learned EIGRP. That's what we're doing. It's simple implementation. There's 3 lines of config. So I really think that's a driving factor.
Oh, it is. It's a huge driving factor. In fact, I went to a customer once when I worked for Cisco that said they were switching from OSPF to ISIS, and I asked them why. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, we're studying for our CCIE.
That's
an honest answer, though.
Really bad reason to switch routing protocols. I heard a comment the other day about ISIS. He says the person said, "I thought that was going away."
Yep.
I mean, I think the mentality is that it's a service provider protocol that people are doing away with. When the opposite is true, we're seeing ISIS in more and more implementations, especially in the back end and underneath things that you wouldn't even know ISIS was running. ISIS is being used for transport of BGP loopback, peering addresses and all kinds of different things. So I think there's some misconceptions around it. I'm glad we're talking about it, but from a percentage perspective, there might be 1 or 2% of the people who are watching this who have ISIS in any network they've ever run in their lifetime.
I've never touched it.
Right.
So what is ultimately the main differentiators that we can identify that would say we need to choose ISIS over OSPF, two link state protocols?
Well, I said before, I think it actually has a better scaling characteristics. I think OSPF is changing right now. There's some new stuff going on in OSPF v3 particularly that's pretty exciting about it. I don't know when it's going to make it into code, but I do think there's some interesting things going on there, particularly the TLV work that AC and those guys are doing in the OSPF working group is really interesting to me. The other thing, so I think the scaling issue is one thing. I think the other thing is it's actually easier to understand what a DIS is doing than a DR when you really look at what they do. So again, I like DIS better than DR. I like mesh groups and ISIS better than mesh groups and OSPF. there's a lot of little things that you get into that, to me, it's actually easier to understand. When I do a show ISIS database detail, it's easier for me to understand what ISIS is doing because it uses those long net numbers. So in my mind, when I see a type 22 or something like that, where I'm actually looking what the router is advertising for neighbor adjacencies, it's easy in my mind to separate topology from reachability in ISIS because it's two different address spaces. And in V4 OSPF, in OSPF v2, when you're running V4 routing, they're actually the same thing. So you do a show OSPF database, and it's like I'm looking at router IDs, but they look like IP addresses, and they're formatted that way.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. That's
a really good point.
My mind is going, oh, these are reachable destinations. I want to ping those things. Right. They look IP addresses, and they're not pingable really necessarily. They're not IP addresses. So in my mind, when I'm troubleshooting, it's easier for me to troubleshoot ISIS just because mentally I can separate the topology from the reachability in my brain when I'm processing the outputs.
I think that's such an interesting perspective because for most of us, when we learn routing, we don't have any concept of this control plane, data plane, those characteristics, right, or those separators. And so I think that if that is built into the protocols, it helps people think differently about routing and may help to improve our conceptual understanding of how the network really works. If I said that in a way that makes sense.
No, that's very good. Yeah.
Yep. And see, I think I'm going to take a slightly different position than Russ because, and you look, especially, and I have to come down in two different camps here because I live in the service provider world and I live in the enterprise world. So I'm shelving the service provider section for a minute and going enterprise. And I think, OSPF is almost the go-to protocol because there's so many things out there that don't support ISIS. And so I think, and then it gets down to, well, is OSPF really going to be the protocol that I'm using to connect to the data center or the WAN, or am I going to use it for reachability for like an IBGP autonomous system? So it also kind of depends on that answer is, what am I using my IGP for? Is my IGP exist because it is the routing protocol, or does it exist because it's going to connect to BGP? And so I think you have to kind of delineate that as well.
Yeah, sure.
You guys, for me, and I agree 100% with you on ISIS's, its performance and its characteristics against OSPF. My problem is I can't find it in as much stuff, as far as, and then you get into redistribution, and that's, it's my ejection seat. I don't want to have to fire the ejection.
Right. Yeah. Sure. So just get all the firewall vendors to produce ISIS code. Or
it's not just firewalls though. There's so many appliances, so many other things that will run a protocol and allow you to dynamically fail between paths. And so, I just don't see ISIS very often.
Have we heard of NFV?
There's another show.
Yes. I can't wait for it to
Got that down. Show notes for show 4.
Show 4.
So let's open Pandora's box of BGP. When is BGP a good choice for enterprise deployments?
Always. Yes.
Always. Says the service provider guy. That's what he says. Yes, BGP solves everything.
It does.
Yeah, so
I have a problem and a hammer.
That's right. So to me, when I started saying at the last IETF, which people thought was kind of humorous, is I said that BGP has become the trash can of the internet.
Explain, please. Elaborate.
If we need to solve any problem, we use BGP. It's done. We use it on data center fabrics. We use it for overlay networks. We use it for, everything.
Just build an address family and your problem's solved.
Yeah, exactly. Not. But anyway, so I think that BGP is very useful when you are using BGP for what it's designed to be used for, which is to interconnect multiple administrative domains or to carry policy in a way that makes sense in a network. I think we use it far too much for routing, and it's really a policy. It's more around policy. And we also don't think about things like, in a data center, Peter Lupkoff and I had this long discussion about BGP convergence in a data center fabric and using eBGP. Well, eBGP, frankly, does not converge all that fast.
On purpose, right?
Convergence, And so is that, sure, so you can offset it in a data center by having in-way multipath and everything else. Sure. But nonetheless, there's this point where you have to think, all right, am I really just using the same tool for everything because I know how to use the tool? As Yvonne said, I have a hammer, right? I'm just going to use it. Everything's a nail because I have a hammer. So I find a lot of places where I use BGP in enterprises. I've used BGP to connect data centers together over a network core. Or if I have a large bank core, I might use BGP to connect all the sites and stuff like that. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think that when we get to the point where we're using BGP for everything, it becomes problematic. That's kind of my...
I completely agree with that, because the protocol wasn't made to do all those things. I mean, it does do them okay, right? But I mean, I agree with you. It's BGP at its heart is a policy engine. How do I make decisions about which path I want traffic to flow down, especially when it comes to like the edge, or even within my network, if there's, large subsections that I want to route via policy versus via routing protocol, where I don't want to have to be tuning metrics on individual links, but rather be talking about, I want the next destination for this to be this router, because that's the ingress point that I want it taking into this particular data center. I had a customer who was a really good example. They're an organization that has sites in all kinds of different places, the 400, 500 sites, but all kinds of different connectivity. So some of it is, they have two different, MPLS clouds. They've got satellite, they've got 4G, 3G, and there's just all of these choices as to which path it should go down. And they're having the hardest time setting IGP to make decisions about their routing prioritization, about which they would prefer to go down first. Right. If I have an MPLS path first, I want to go down that first. If I have this other MPLS provider, that's my secondary path. And so we're in the process of implementing a BGP core there, where all of the different transit mechanisms come in so that we can make a policy decision about leaving and entering the core.
Yeah, and BGP gives you per destination policy, which you're just not going to get in IGP. Right? It just doesn't exist. I mean, you can hack around it. You can put tags in ISIS or OSPF or EIGRP and play with route maps and all, but really that's what BGP is designed for, is gives you per destination reachability policy that allows you to tune a lot of stuff. It's a great protocol for what it's used for and what it should be used for, but...
Well, that's a great point, Russ, because I think, my challenge in a lot of the enterprises I work in, which, tend to be larger, is I've moved towards BGP for everything. Now, obviously, what we typically will do within the data center is run it as an iBGP OS and run OSPF for reachability. But you get to the point where, I'm working right now where we're dealing with communities for intercontinental transit. We're trying to deal with traffic in Europe. We're trying to deal with traffic in North America. You've got 7,000 routes in a private table, and it's, well, where does this one belong? Well, you can use a community to say, well, that came from the Eastern time zone in North America. And then, based on that information, you can say, well, you should go here, under these conditions. And I guess ultimately this is a problem that SD-WAN is really starting to solve. So, I think that's the next evolution.
He went down the SD-WAN.
But and I'm going to say that because, and I'm a routing guy at heart. I love BGP. So, but staying within the confines of what, this is, I think it's really the only way to solve that problem. And I look at a data center today when I've got to go design one. And, it's not like the old days where, okay, you had like 2 private circuits and 2 internet paths and they were redundant and that's what you had. Now it's, well, I've got these 16 private circuits over here and I've got all this stuff. And it's, how do you do it with OSPF? You can't. There's almost no way if you're going to have to set some kind of a, policy and preference other than to overlay BGP, on top of it.
Right.
And then I think you get into, for the data centers, I don't deal with so much the scaling size on the enterprise that you do. I do more on the service provider side. But then it gets into, in the enterprise data centers, I'll typically use iBGP with an IGP underneath. But then you get into some of the things that you deal with, whereas that maybe doesn't scale when you're dealing with, web scale stuff. You've got to go into something else.
So the problem I have too is that, and this is not just, where I am, but all over the place that I talk to people at web scale companies is that, well, look, I'm running BGP on my data center fabric. Why can't I just tune my traffic on my data center fabric using communities? Wait. You're going to do traffic engineering with BGP communities on a data center fabric. No, don't. Okay. When your data center top of rack switch configuration gets to 1,000 lines, you'll know why this is not a good idea.
No, you need MPLS traffic engineering within the data center. That's the right way to solve that problem.
Or segment routing or something, right?
Yeah, segment routing.
But nonetheless, I mean, that's kind of the problem, right? Is that you give people knobs and they turn the knobs because they're pretty and they get to do a lot of stuff with them. And sometimes you just don't want the knobs to be there.
Yeah.
There's an interesting comment from Twitter here from Matt Hato. It's just another component to the whole discussion. And I think it's interesting because my mind didn't even go there. He says, it's a shame that when we talk about BGP everywhere, my first thought is licensing costs. And mainly just because it's, the highest level of licensing, at least in Cisco world, right? That you don't get BGP and advanced features until you license to the very top level.
Yeah, there's a solution for that.
Well, yeah.
Oh boy, use free range routing.
Yeah.
Says the guy whose whole job is disaggregation right now.
Well, Kevin, we can run it all on 3850s, I hear, right?
Yeah, I'm very surprised. So I'm working a project overseas right now, and we were supposed to have some 4500Xs to build an internet zone, and they didn't show up. And they were like, well, we got 3850s, and man, they do Lisp and BGP and ODR, which is what Jordan was bucking for.
There you go.
It was good stuff.
And the protocol, which will remain unmentioned.
And the protocol, the protocol that shall not be named.
That's exactly right.
Well, there's two of those. You said one of those bad words, those 4 little words, that Lisp thing in there too. So
yeah.
So let's talk about business drivers a little bit. I've heard Russ talk a lot about your network as a competitive advantage, and it's not just a thing which gets data from point A to point B, but actually it is a competitive advantage for the business. So what kinds of business drivers would influence how we would select a routing protocol, do you think?
Well, okay, Yvonne, you go right for the jugular there. So from my perspective, and of course, I'm coming from a disaggregated world, right? I'm coming from a world that's going to white box and is very concerned about this. But from my perspective, the bang for the buck is in the network control plane. That's where the business policy really impacts the network. It's not down in the hardware and stuff. I mean, I know we all like to talk about ASICs and how much buffering they have and how they do this, and that's all really cool. But the real business meets the rubber meets the road for the business in the routing protocol, or in the control plane, I should say. So the things that we don't think about when we're doing from a business perspective are these policy issues, right? What is going to happen if I try to build policy into OSPF or ISIS? It's going to be a mess. What's going to happen if I try to make BGP into my IGP because, hey, I can do it, and because I need all those policies? And at some point, you've got to start thinking about where the complexity comes in. And, I'm always going to go to complexity. Everyone knows I'm always going to go to complexity. When you start thinking about complexity and how the complexity falls into it, what you really want to do is build a suite of tools, not a single tool, that solves all the problems in a flexible way. And so that, to me, is where it comes into. I mean, from my perspective, if you're as big as some of the hyperscalers, you should be able to build your own routing protocol that matches what your business does very well. And that's the way it should work. If you're a smaller player, maybe you can't, but maybe you can use tools that are out there and think more about what's out there and how to use them better in a way that actually makes an advantage for your business.
Yeah, you're preaching and being an engineer, Russ. I've heard you do it a lot of times, right?
I know.
Just getting back to our roots of saying this is the problem. Let's find a solution and engineer something.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, y'all keep saying enterprise and service provider, and that's actually a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah. There is no enterprise and no service provider. I get it.
I want to hear your thoughts.
I don't know any enterprises that need to blast through mountains to get fiber through. So I slightly disagree with that.
Okay, so maybe on layer 1. Okay, we gotcha.
Yeah, layer 1 maybe, but I don't know. From a routing perspective, there are problems and there are solutions. That's it.
Yeah, and I agree with that. You're right.
And the reason that it comes to my mind so much is because I go to so many large enterprise accounts and they say, I was in a company 2 years ago and they said to me, well, we can't deploy MPLS. We are an enterprise. We don't have the,
Okay.
like, you what? No, we're an enterprise. We have to deploy VXLAN because we're an enterprise. We can't deploy MPLS.
So Russ, that happens to me all the time because coming from more of a service provider background than an enterprise background, that's, well, really MPLS, VPN-v4 would be the right thing to do here for the isolation that you want. And it's that's that service provider. That's an ISP thing. And it's like, well, it's a tool. It's 10 years ago, it was crazy to put BGP in a data center, but some people started doing it and it was like, oh, this solves a problem. It does something for us. And I think that's a great point that you have a bunch of tools in the bag and you use the tools that you have in the bag.
Right. Well, and they're both layer 2.5, but which one are you familiar with? Right?
I think the other thing that is in there is that when you design and when you talk about routing protocols, and not even outside the scope of routing protocols, I think that we think it's better to run more things. It's always more fun to run more things, but I think speaking to Kevin's point earlier about avoiding redistribution if you can, and the way you select your protocol should be about simplicity, right, and easy to manage and meeting the goals. Right, you need to know the goals, but the goals are not technical goals. The goals are business goals. We use technical solutions to meet business goals.
That's exactly right.
Right. And so those technical solutions might be, how fast the failover happens or how quick a route redistributes. And not everyone needs super fast convergence. Not everyone needs it. Some people need it. Some people don't. It might be great for some networks, and tuning to that level might be more troublesome in a network that doesn't need it, because now you're dealing with the complexities of fast timers or a protocol that's more difficult to manage.
Or you just drop BFD on 100 routers and you don't know what it does.
Exactly. And so, I always take the approach that, for every line of config you enter, you need to know why you're doing it. And it's not because you want to.
Yeah.
It's because you're putting that in there for a very specific purpose, and that should be tied to a business purpose. It's not something we do well, I think, as an industry. Some people do it well. I'm not going to put everybody with that broad brushstroke, but we really should be designing only as complex as what's required. If you can get away with one protocol, do that one protocol. If you need two, then you need two. Complexity isn't always bad so long as it's solving a problem for you.
Yeah, that's
exactly. Complexity out of the necessity. You make a good point, because choosing a routing protocol, which is the name of the show today, and the overarching context in which we're speaking, we're bringing in business decision makers now at that point who don't know the difference between ISIS and OSPF or EIGRP or whatever. They're trusting us to inform them. But ultimately, where's the business going to be in 5 years? Are we in a process of acquiring new locations and spinning up new sites? Are we interested in disaggregating, the control plane and data plane for whatever reason? So yeah, bringing in those other voices is important too. And that's not something I've typically done. Working in non-web scale companies, it's sort of, you go with what you know. But you're right. The business drivers are really what pushes that decision along.
So let's try to give two examples, right?
Okay.
So say you are a company that's a heavy acquisition company. You do a lot of acquisitions in your company, and you find that 90% of the people you acquire run OSPF. Does it make any sense to run ISIS, even though it might actually solve the technical problems in your network better, when 90% of the people you integrate are going to be running OSPF? I don't know. Maybe it's crazy to retrain all those people. But on the other side, if you're a small company that is thinking, well, I'm a little financial company, I do day trading stuff, and maybe I'm going to do a Hadoop thing. Oh, wait, you just told me you're building a data center fabric in the future. You need to think about your routing protocol from a data center fabric perspective today.
Right.
Don't think about what it means 5 years from now. When you build the data center, you're like, oops, we used OSPF and it won't scale in our data center fabric. Yeah, you should have thought about that 5 years ago before you put all this money into training and effort building this. You should have thought about where you were going and chosen a routing protocol that would scale in that environment, right? And you should have started, we're not, like the disaggregation thing, right? Well, in 5 years, we may build a big data center. Okay, well, you know what? The time to get experience with building a Unix box that runs as a router is now, not 5 years from now, okay?
It might take you 5 years to get there. Yeah,
it
exactly.
Might take you 5 years to get there, right?
Yeah.
So learn it now. Don't, and and grow your engineers. I think that's part of the problem we have is this is kind of my pushback on the familiarity thing. Sure, it's great that everybody knows OSPF, but are we growing engineers by doing the same thing we've always done just because it's easier to hire off the street? Maybe Facebook and other people have the right idea here. You hire people for their intelligence, and then you grow engineers internally. And you don't hire big names unless you need them, or you don't hire people, who are well experienced but set in their ways. You hire people who are flexible, and you hire for flexibility and engineering skill, not for, we run all OSPF and they know OSPF, so I'm happy. No, that's
an interesting perspective, and I wish our environments ran that way. I'm just not picturing a whole lot of environments that would feel comfortable saying that we're going to grow engineers because it's not their business driver. It's not the thing that they do as a business, right? And I know I can see it on your face, right? Right, that the network is part of driving the business forward. I can see it. I know exactly what you're saying. I think we have some work to do there. I agree with you 100%, but I don't think if you went and go talk to, 100 CEOs today, that even 50% of them would identify their network as a competitive advantage or a business driver or
probably not even 50%, probably 5%, 10%. And yeah, that's our fault. I consider that my fault, right?
We need to educate. We need to be explaining how we can
educating my CEO, right?
Mm-hmm. No.
And I'm not doing it obviously if he doesn't think it's important.
So Jordan, you make a great point there. And I think, and the education, we actually already educated ourselves. And part of the problem I run into is all of us went through, the Cisco certification paths, some more than others, like Russ. I think, didn't you do all of them?
He wrote
some of them.
I'm not kidding. People come up to me and show me Cisco validated designs and say, well, OSPF is the right protocol because it says so in this book. And I was like, yeah, and it was written 12 years ago. And so part of the thing that's holding us back is, one of the best things about what Cisco's done with their education program is also one of the hardest things for us to break away from is we get used to reading these validated designs in CCNA, CCNP, CCIE, and you say, this is when you use this, and this is how you use this. And then you have a whole group of engineers worldwide that say, well, I can only use OSPF for this. And so fighting that lock-in mentality from everybody coming out of the Cisco world is, for me, it's a huge challenge because I'm a very multi-vendor, type of shop in the way I operate. And it's a challenge.
I'll give you a perfect example. Many years ago, the Cisco Online said OSPF should be limited to 50 routers.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah, I remember that. Right?
You should have seen the huge internal argument to get that off the webpage. This was not like, small peas. This was like a huge argument for months to get that off the webpage.
So now we're on OSPF. Is that what you're saying?
At all. I do have a question / comment coming in from Twitter from Michael Nelson. He mentioned a little earlier, specifically with regard to BGP EVPN overlay protocols, how they'd work with ISIS. And then he brought it up again a little bit later, basically asking what your thoughts are, guys, on BGP EVPN.
EVPN, you could do your whole show on data center fabrics and overlays like that. So, I don't know how far we can dive into that. But there's going to be two schools of thought. You're either going to really like it because it solves your data center fabric problem, or you're not going to like it because we're jamming yet another thing into BGP and now transmitting layer 2 information over BGP for, adjacency and layer 2 connectivity across layer 3 boundaries.
So I guess I don't know if you've read what I've written on the IETF in the past, but I kind of have this perspective that EVPNs, like everything else in the IETF, started out as a really neat idea, like Trill, right? There's nothing wrong with layer 2 carrying layer 2 in ISIS or BGP. What we tend to do, though, is we tend to think of every potential corner case that anyone can ever think of out of the 2,000 or 3,000 smartest people in the world on routing protocols.
That sounds dangerous.
Together in one place and sit down and think about what is every potential corner case that could ever occur and how we solve it. Okay,
And they came up with BGP.
No, they came up with the current implementation of EVPNs, which is a good idea. But then you have all these weird things in there, like, hey, I have this router that runs BGP, but it doesn't do routing. Wait, you have a what? Yeah, I have this device. It's a top of rack switch, and it doesn't do routing, but it runs BGP, and it can strip MPLS labels. Yes. Wait, I want to see one of these.
All right, guys, we are getting close to our, we're past our 30-minute mark, to tell you the truth. So just want to see if Russ and Kevin have any closing thoughts on the best way or how to think about choosing a routing protocol other than, just pick BGP or just pick RSIS.
We've distilled it down to 2.
No, use the EdgeRP. Be different.
Be different.
Be different. Buy Cisco licenses.
There we have it.
There you go.
All right. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us this evening, today.
Wherever you are, whatever time it is.
Whenever you are. Check out the website, which is thenetworkcollective.com, or follow us on Twitter, NetCollectivePC. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, and we'll be interacting with you on Twitter. So we'd love to hear your responses or thoughts about this episode, and we will see you again soon.